Welcome back. It's strange how someone can be out of your life, and yet the mind keeps making space for them, like it's waiting for something that never arrives, like it's still trying to finish a conversation that ended months ago. The worst part is that the truth is already known, the pattern was clear, and the damage was real, but attention still circles back, not because the mind is weak, but because something inside it feels unfinished, and unfinished things stay active. That's why moving on can feel confusing, because the outside can look normal, while the inside keeps returning, and the return doesn't always look like love. It often looks like checking, rereading, replaying, imagining the message that should have been sent, or hearing their voice inside the head at the most random times. It can show up in the quiet moments, in the late night scroll, in the empty space after a long day, and it can feel like the mind is betraying the decision that was already made. Most people try to solve that by forcing themselves to let go, or by distracting harder, or by seeking closure from the same person who created the confusion, and then they feel worse when it doesn't work, because the loop returns and they start believing that something is wrong with them. But what's happening is usually not a moral failure, and it's not a lack of self-respect. It's a psychological mechanism that becomes stronger when it stays unnamed. The mind does not release what it experiences as incomplete. When something ends cleanly, it can be stored as finished, but when something ends with mixed signals, unclear meaning, or a story that never reached a stable ending, the brain keeps it open in the background, like a tab that never closes. And that open tab keeps pulling attention back whenever stress rises, whenever loneliness increases, or whenever the nervous system wants certainty. That's why the obsession is often strongest when there was no clear conclusion, because uncertainty creates mental tension, and the brain tries to reduce that tension by returning to the topic again and again, hoping that one more replay will finally make it make sense. The mind keeps searching for the missing piece, the missing message, the missing explanation, and even when the person is gone, the brain continues the search internally, because it wants completion more than it wants romance. This is also why the good memories can feel louder than the bad ones, because the brain is not replaying reality, it is replaying what keeps the story open. It replays the beginning, the rare warmth, the special moments, the part that felt promising, and it pushes away the pattern that broke trust, because the pattern would close the story, and the mind is still attached to the possibility that the story could have been different. So the real question is not, why can't this be forgotten? Because forgetting is not the goal of the brain. The real question is, what is the brain still trying to complete? Because once that is understood, the loop stops feeling like fate and starts feeling like a process that can be interrupted. This video breaks that process down in a clear way, without blaming anyone and without forcing fake confidence. Because the goal is not to pretend the connection didn't matter. The goal is to understand why the mind stays attached even when the truth is known, and how to close the loop without needing another conversation, another message, or another emotional risk. The structure is simple, and it follows the way the mind actually works. First, it will become clear why the brain craves closure more than it craves the person. Then it will become obvious how attachment can form around a version of someone rather than around the reality of their pattern. After that, the role of inconsistency will be explained, because unpredictable reward creates obsession in a way steady affection never does. Then the deeper identity layer will be exposed, because moving on becomes hardest when letting go feels like losing a part of the self. Finally, there will be a practical move-on protocol that replaces confusion with structure, so the nervous system can calm down and the mind can stop returning to the same chapter. And it starts here, because the first hidden reason people can't move on is not weakness and not love. It is the mind's need to close what feels unfinished. Enclosure is not a feeling that arises by itself. It is a process that has to be created. The first hidden reason the mind struggles to move on is that it craves closure, and closure is not the same as having answers, because answers are facts, while closure is a state of completion that the nervous system can accept. When an ending is clear, the brain stores it as finished, even if it hurts, because pain can be processed when it has a shape. When an ending is unclear, the mind keeps returning, because uncertainty has no shape, and what has no shape cannot be put down. Mixed signals, sudden distance, vague explanations, silent exits, or situations where the person returned and disappeared repeatedly all create the same effect, which is an open loop, and open loops keep attention active. This is why the mind can return even after months, because it is not returning to the person, it is returning to the unfinished question. The question can sound like, "What was that?" or "Why did they change?" or "Was it real?" or "Did I matter?" And those questions carry emotional weight because they touch identity. When identity is touched, the brain treats the question as important, and important questions stay in the foreground until they feel resolved. The most common mistake at this stage is believing that closure must come from the other person. That belief keeps people emotionally tied because it trains the mind to wait, and waiting keeps the loop alive. It creates a state of mental dependence where peace is delayed until a message arrives, until an apology happens, until a confession is made, until the story is explained properly. And that is why people remain stuck, because the mind is waiting for someone else to complete a process that has to become internal. Another reason closure is difficult is that the brain prefers certainty even when certainty is painful. Uncertainty produces mental tension, and tension demands action. And when there is no action that can solve it, the brain uses rumination as a substitute. Rumination is not reflection, because reflection is aimed at learning, while rumination is aimed at control, and control is what the mind tries to regain when something ended in a way that felt confusing. A practical way to distinguish reflection from rumination is to notice whether the thinking produces clarity or simply repeats the same emotional scene. When the mind keeps replaying the same moments and generating the same questions without producing a decision, that is not thinking, it is looping, and the purpose of the loop is not insight, it is relief. The mind keeps hoping that one more replay will finally reduce uncertainty, but the replay usually creates more interpretations, and more interpretations create more tension. This is why moving on begins with replacing the need for perfect answers with a stronger form of closure, which is acceptance of what is knowable. What is knowable is behavior, pattern, consistency, and the way the dynamic affected the nervous system. What is often not knowable is the full inner truth of the other person, their hidden reasons, their private feelings, and the complete explanation that makes everything feel fair. When a person requires the unknowable to move on, they stay stuck, because the brain cannot close what it insists on fully understanding. When a person bases closure on the knowable, the loop becomes easier to shut down, because behavior is evidence, and evidence has shape. This is where a Stoic perspective becomes useful, because it refuses to build peace on what cannot be controlled, and it refuses to rent stability from someone else's willingness to explain. It focuses on what is within control, which is interpretation, standards, boundaries, and the decision to stop feeding the loop with attention. The move here is internal closure. An internal closure is created through a simple but disciplined statement that the mind returns to every time it tries to reopen the loop. The statement is not an emotional speech, and it is not a dramatic conclusion. It is a clean recognition that pattern is enough. It can be held like this. The ending was not unclear because something was missing. It was unclear because the dynamic was unstable, and instability does not become stable through analysis. When that recognition becomes consistent, the mind starts losing interest in replaying the same chapter, because the chapter finally has a conclusion, and the conclusion is not based on a perfect explanation, it is based on reality. However, even when closure is created internally, many people still feel pulled back, because the attachment was not only to the unanswered question, it was to a version of the person that existed in imagination more than in daily life. That is the next layer, because the mind often doesn't miss the reality. It misses the version that felt possible. The second hidden reason people struggle to move on is that they are often attached to a version of the person that does not exist consistently in reality, but exists vividly in memory and imagination, and the mind has a powerful tendency to protect that version because it represents possibility. When a connection begins, especially one that feels intense or meaningful, the early moments create a strong imprint. The attention is focused, the energy is high, conversations feel effortless, and the future seems open. That early phase does not only create attraction, it creates projection, because the mind begins filling in gaps with hope, imagining what stability would look like, what commitment would feel like, what growth together could become. When inconsistency later appears, the brain does not immediately discard the projection. Instead, it separates the person into two categories without consciously admitting it. There is the version that was warm, present, and emotionally available, and there is the version that was distant, distracted, or unreliable. The mind then chooses which version to emotionally invest in, and it almost always chooses the one that felt good, because that version supports hope. This selective attachment is subtle but powerful, because the longing is not for the full pattern, it is for the highlight reel. It is for the beginning, the apology, the rare deep conversation, the brief moment of closeness that felt different from everything else. Those moments become amplified in memory, and the pattern that followed becomes minimized, because the mind prefers possibility over disappointment. That is why people often say they miss who they were in the beginning, or miss how it used to feel, because what they are actually missing is the imagined trajectory, the story that could have unfolded if consistency had followed intensity. The loss is not only of a person, it is of a potential future, and potential futures can be more emotionally powerful than present reality. The mind also resists letting go of that version, because releasing it feels like admitting that it was never fully real. It feels like admitting that the meaning attached to those early moments may have been one-sided or exaggerated. That admission touches pride, vulnerability, and identity, and the brain protects identity by holding on to the fantasy longer than it should. A useful way to break this illusion is to examine the ratio rather than the peak. Instead of asking how strong the good moments felt, the question becomes how consistent they were. Instead of measuring intensity, the measure becomes stability. When the full pattern is observed without emotional filtering, the attachment begins to weaken naturally, because attachment thrives on contrast, and when contrast is removed, clarity increases. The Stoic discipline here is to favor reality over imagination, because imagination without evidence creates suffering. Reality may be disappointing, but disappointment closes chapters, while imagination keeps them open. Once the mind accepts the full pattern rather than protecting the idealized version, the emotional pull begins to shift, because it becomes harder to long for something that never truly existed in the form it was desired. Yet, even after fantasy is exposed and closure is created, another force can still hold the mind in place, and this force is not romantic or philosophical, it is neurological. It is the effect of inconsistency on reward systems, and it is one of the strongest drivers of obsession in human behavior, because the brain does not become attached most intensely to what is always available. It becomes attached to what is unpredictably available. The third hidden reason it feels so hard to move on has very little to do with romance, and a lot to do with how the brain reacts to unpredictable reward, because the nervous system does not become obsessed with what is steady and secure, it becomes obsessed with what is uncertain and inconsistent. When affection, attention, or reassurance is stable, the body relaxes, because it knows what to expect, and it does not need to monitor constantly for change. When affection is given intensely one day and withdrawn the next, the nervous system becomes alert, because unpredictability signals potential loss, and potential loss demands focus. That focus can feel like passion, but it is often heightened vigilance. Inconsistent behavior creates emotional peaks and valleys, and those peaks and valleys train the brain to chase the high that follows the low. A warm message after distance can feel disproportionately powerful, not because it is objectively extraordinary, but because it arrives after tension. Relief after tension is neurologically stronger than pleasure without tension, and over time the mind starts associating that cycle with meaning. This is why someone can feel more drawn to a person who creates instability than to a person who offers steady presence. Stability does not trigger urgency, and urgency is often misinterpreted as depth. The anxious waiting, the overanalyzing, the scanning for signals, all of it keeps the other person mentally active even when they are physically absent. Attention becomes locked, and locked attention feels like attachment. The mind also starts creating narratives around rare positive moments. If kindness appears occasionally, it can be magnified into proof that they do care. If closeness returns briefly, it can be interpreted as evidence that things can still work. The brain ignores frequency and focuses on intensity, because intensity is what registers most strongly in memory. This creates a loop that looks like hope but functions like conditioning. Distance creates discomfort. Discomfort creates craving. Craving creates pursuit. Pursuit sometimes produces connection. That occasional connection reinforces the pursuit, and the cycle strengthens. It does not need to work every time to stay alive. It only needs to work sometimes. When the dynamic ends, the nervous system can experience something that feels like withdrawal. The body expects a message, a return, a sudden spike of attention, and when it does not arrive, restlessness increases. That restlessness is often mistaken for proof that the connection was special, but it is more accurate to see it as a system adjusting to the absence of a stimulus it became used to. This explains why healing can initially feel flat or dull. Stability does not create the same spikes. Calm does not feel as dramatic as longing. Predictability does not feel as intense as uncertainty. The brain has to recalibrate to experience consistency as safety rather than boredom, and that recalibration takes time. Recognizing this mechanism reduces self-blame because it reframes the difficulty of moving on as a conditioned response rather than a personal flaw. The urge to return is not necessarily a sign of destiny or weakness. It is often a sign that the nervous system became accustomed to unpredictability and is now searching for it again. However, even when reward patterns are understood and distance is maintained, there is still another layer that keeps some people tied to the past, and that layer is identity. Letting go does not only mean losing a person. It can mean losing a version of oneself that existed inside that connection. And that is where the attachment becomes deeper than chemistry or fantasy, because it begins to touch the sense of who someone believes they are. The fourth hidden reason people struggle to move on is that identity becomes entangled with the connection, and when identity is entangled, letting go feels like losing more than a person, because it feels like losing a version of the self that existed in that space. This is why some people can end a relationship and still feel haunted, not by the person's presence, but by what the relationship represented. It may have represented being chosen, being desired, being understood, being seen, or finally being enough in a way that once felt uncertain. When the connection ends, it is not only the person that disappears, it is the reflection the mind enjoyed seeing, and the loss of that reflection can create a deep internal emptiness. Identity attachment also shows up when self-worth has been placed inside the outcome. If being valued depended on being kept, then being left feels like a verdict. If being loved depended on being perfect, then rejection feels like exposure. If the relationship became proof of worth, then the ending becomes proof of deficiency, even if the truth is more complex and the behavior of the other person had its own causes. This is why moving on can feel like a threat to self-image. The mind may know the pattern was unhealthy, but another part of the mind is still trying to protect a belief, such as the belief that the bond was special, or that the effort will eventually be rewarded, or that loyalty will be recognized. Those beliefs often come from deeper experiences, not just from the relationship itself, and when they are activated, the mind resists letting go because letting go feels like admitting that the belief was wrong. There is also a form of identity attachment that comes from familiarity. Many people unconsciously return to what matches old emotional environments, even when those environments are painful. If someone grew up feeling they had to earn attention, then chasing can feel normal. If someone grew up around inconsistency, then instability can feel familiar. Familiarity is powerful because it feels predictable, and predictability can be mistaken for safety even when it produces anxiety. This is where the mind does something subtle. It confuses intensity with meaning, and it confuses struggle with depth, because struggle is what it learned early as the price of connection. When that is the internal blueprint, peace can feel unfamiliar, and unfamiliar can feel wrong, even when unfamiliar is exactly what healing looks like. Breaking this layer requires a shift in self-image that is independent of the other person's choice. It requires building a stable sense of worth that does not rise with attention and collapse with distance. It requires learning to measure value by character, discipline, and integrity rather than by being selected by someone who may not have been stable themselves. This is not done through affirmations that sound good, but change nothing. It is done through evidence, because the mind believes what behavior repeatedly proves. When promises are kept to the self, when boundaries are held, when effort is invested into growth, identity becomes stronger. When identity becomes stronger, the need for external validation weakens, and when the need weakens, the pull to return weakens too. This is the turning point, because once identity is no longer tied to the past stops feeling like a missing part of the self. It becomes a chapter that shapes perspective, but it is no longer required for stability. Now the final step is to turn all of this into a protocol, because understanding the reasons is powerful, but the nervous system also needs structure. The mind needs a clear method that closes the loop, removes reinforcement, and replaces what the connection was providing with something healthier and more stable. That is how moving on becomes practical rather than motivational, and it begins with a simple principle that changes everything. The goal is not to erase memory. The goal is to stop feeding the mechanism. The final step is practical, because insight without structure leaves the nervous system searching for the old pattern again. And when there is no clear plan, emotion tends to win. The first principle of the move-on protocol is full removal of reinforcement, because partial distance keeps the mechanism alive. Small check-ins, casual replies, just seeing how you are, or social media monitoring may look harmless, but they continue the unpredictable reward cycle that created the attachment in the first place. The brain does not differentiate between a full return and a small signal. It simply registers stimulation and resets anticipation. If anticipation resets, the loop stays open. This is why clean boundaries are necessary, not dramatic or emotional ones, but consistent ones. No monitoring, no casual access, no, just one more conversation. Closure is created by ending reinforcement, not by reopening it. The second principle is replacing the function, because the attachment was serving a role. If the connection regulated loneliness, then loneliness must be addressed directly through real social structure, not through digital echoes of the past. If it regulated stress, then stress must be reduced through routine, physical movement, discipline, or purposeful activity. If it boosted self-worth, then achievement and internal integrity must take that role. Without replacement, the brain will try to return to the fastest shortcut it remembers. The third principle is cognitive correction, because the mind will romanticize selectively. It will replay the best moments and mute the pattern. This must be countered deliberately by remembering the full ratio rather than the peak. Not to create anger, but to create accuracy. Accuracy stabilizes emotion because it removes illusion. The fourth principle is identity reinforcement. Every time distance is maintained despite craving, identity strengthens. Every time a boundary is honored despite discomfort, self-trust increases. Over time, the brain begins to associate discipline with relief rather than with deprivation. That shift is subtle but powerful because it transforms growth from punishment into strength. The final principle is patience with recalibration. The nervous system needs time to detach from unpredictability and learn stability. Calm may feel dull at first. Silence may feel empty. Peace may feel unfamiliar. That does not mean something is wrong. It means the system is adjusting to a healthier baseline. When these principles are practiced consistently, something changes quietly. The urge weakens not because memory disappears, but because the mechanism is no longer fed. The fantasy fades because it is not rehearsed. The reward cycle collapses because it is not triggered. The identity stabilizes because it is not outsourced. Moving on stops being about forgetting and starts being about alignment. And this is the closing truth. The real reason it felt impossible to move on was never just love. It was unfinished closure, idealized memory, unpredictable reward, and identity attachment working together beneath awareness. Once those layers are seen clearly, the shame dissolves and the power returns. Moving on is not about becoming cold. It is about becoming clear. It is about choosing peace over familiarity, standards over intensity, and self-respect over repetition, until the past no longer feels magnetic and the future finally feels open again. That is the moment where the narrative changes. At the beginning, it feels like the past is pulling forward, like something unfinished is demanding attention, like peace is being withheld until a certain person returns or a certain explanation arrives. But once the mechanisms are understood and reinforcement is removed, the direction reverses, and instead of the past pulling forward, the present begins pushing ahead. There is a quiet shift that happens when someone realizes they are no longer waiting. They are no longer checking for signs, no longer replaying conversations in search of a different ending, no longer measuring their worth against someone else's attention. The space that once felt heavy begins to feel neutral, and neutral slowly becomes peaceful. This is not dramatic transformation. It is subtle stabilization. There are no fireworks when a loop ends. There is simply less noise. The mind becomes less reactive. The body becomes less tense. The urge appears less frequently and fades more quickly. The name that once triggered a wave of emotion becomes just a name. The memory that once felt magnetic becomes just a memory. And the most important part is this: the person who once felt impossible to release no longer defines direction. They become part of the past without controlling the present. That is when moving on becomes real. Not when the feelings vanish completely, and not when the story is erased, but when the attachment no longer dictates behavior, when longing can exist without action, when memory can exist without pursuit, when identity is no longer tied to being chosen. At that point, the lesson is integrated rather than resisted. You understand that the brain craves closure, that fantasy can distort reality, that inconsistency can train obsession, and that identity can anchor attachment. And instead of fighting those forces blindly, you worked through them deliberately. That is growth. Moving on is not about forgetting someone mattered. It is about recognizing that peace matters more. And when peace becomes the standard, not the reward, the loop ends naturally, because the version of you who needed the old dynamic no longer exists in the same way. That is the real freedom. Not indifference, not bitterness, but clarity strong enough to choose differently. And once clarity becomes consistent, the mind stops circling the past, because it finally understands that nothing is unfinished anymore. The next step is making this stability permanent, because even after clarity arrives, the nervous system can still get pulled on tired days, lonely nights, or stressful weeks, and that is usually when the mind tries to reopen the loop with a reasonable excuse. The urge rarely shows up as pure emotion, because it usually arrives as a convincing story that sounds logical in the moment, and that story often claims that a quick check will bring peace, that one message will finally create closure, or that enough time has passed so the old pattern can't restart. What makes this dangerous is that the story is not really about the person anymore, because it is often about regulation, and the nervous system is trying to return to a familiar shortcut that once brought relief. So the response has to become structured, because a structured response prevents emotional improvisation, and emotional improvisation is where old habits come back wearing a new name. When the pull appears, it helps to name it accurately, not in a dramatic way and not in a self-judging way, but in a calm and precise way that removes the romantic fog. The mind can register that this is not destiny speaking, and it is not a sign that something must be done, because it is a predictable response to an old loop that used to be reinforced, and loops lose power when reinforcement stops. Over time, the system changes quietly, because urges become less frequent and less intense when they are not rewarded, and the mind becomes less interested in finishing a chapter that never had stable structure. The reward cycle weakens when it is not triggered, The image fades when it is not rehearsed, and identity becomes stronger when it stops outsourcing worth to someone else's attention. This is where the final shift becomes a standard that protects the future. Peace stops being something that must be earned through someone's response, because peace becomes the baseline that decisions are built around. Clarity becomes more valuable than mixed signals. Stability becomes more valuable than intensity, and self-respect becomes more valuable than temporary relief. When that standard becomes real, the mind stops asking whether it should return, and it starts asking whether returning matches the person it is becoming. That is when moving on becomes real, not because feelings never rise again, but because feelings no longer control direction. The past becomes a teacher instead of a magnet. The memory becomes a lesson instead of a leash, and the future opens up again through disciplined clarity rather than through luck. And if things feel overwhelming right now, please don't carry that alone, because it's important to talk to someone you trust today, like a parent, relative, close friend, or another trusted adult, especially if you're feeling unsafe. If you think you might act on those feelings, contact your local emergency number immediately or go to the nearest emergency service, because your safety matters more than finishing any script. From there, the focus shifts away from debating the healing and toward replacing the function, because the attachment was never only emotional, it was functional. If the connection gave relief, then relief must be created elsewhere. If it gave distraction, then distraction must be replaced with purpose. If it gave validation, then validation must be rebuilt through self-trust, and self-trust is built by actions that are kept consistently, not by explanations that sound good in the moment. That means choosing a regulation action that changes state in the body and creates stability in the day, such as movement, training, a walk with intention, focused work, a task that produces visible progress, or a real conversation with a stable person who does not trigger the reward cycle of unpredictability. These actions are not meant to delete emotion, because they are meant to prevent emotion from becoming behavior, and that separation is what turns healing into power. At the same time, accuracy has to stay stronger than nostalgia, because nostalgia edits reality in a way that keeps the loop alive. The brain tends to replay the peak moments and soften the pattern, which is why the mind must return to evidence that is calm and honest. The right measure is not intensity, because intensity is easy to produce with inconsistency, but the right measure is consistency, respect, and emotional safety over time. When the mind keeps measuring the full pattern instead of the best moment, the fantasy loses oxygen, and the attachment loses its most seductive fuel.